The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, progressives call on politicians for a relief package that meets the needs of all Americans. Plus, how the Electoral College is bad for democracy and why it needs to end. And Bill Press talks with Stephanie Schriock, president of Emily's List. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. The coronavirus pandemic has laid bare our nation's devastating disparities in health and wealth. Activist Emma Einhorn says the next relief package has to put people first and commit to an America that works for all. And we say hello to Emma Einhorn, campaign director for MoveOn.org. Emma, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Our pleasure to have you with us. You know, your organization was one of nearly 50 progressive organizations who sent a joint letter to Speaker Pelosi, Leader Schumer, and congressional Democrats to lead with a bold, inclusive relief plan. How did this letter come about?
It came from a sense of need. You know, we are a lot of organizations with millions of members across the country, and we are hearing from folks that this is an unprecedented moment. We have over 30 million people unemployed. We have a crisis of healthcare, a crisis of our economy, and a crisis with our democracy. And so as we were all trying to organize and bring these folks together, there are literally hundreds of asks of Congress right now because every community needs something and needs something a little bit different to meet the specific needs of that community. And we know that these Republican bills that have been coming out are not a good starting point. They are not focused on putting people first. They are focused on corporations and the wealthy, and that's not a place where we want to be negotiating. We want to be putting people first and getting these big, bold programs out there. So we started these groups first with a town hall. We held last week with Representative Presley, Clyburn, Chuy Garcia, and a few others so that they could hear directly from people in the communities about how this is affecting them and what they need. And out of that town hall came this letter so that we could use our collective power and lean into the leverage that Democrats have in the House to make sure that in the next relief bill, people are put first.
That's great. Now, the letter speaks to both short-term and long-term concerns that are embedded in the pandemic. So let's start with the short term. Regarding protection and treatment, what do you want Congress to do so health care is delivered in an equitable way?
Yeah, so the first is filling the gaps in the relief that's already been passed. So we need actual free testing for all. We don't have that right now. First, immigrants and the undocumented are left out of the free testing that is available. And second, the test may be free, but the visit to your doctor or the hospital isn't. The other services that you get in that visit aren't. And so you may go to the hospital thinking that you're about to get a free test and then be hit with a $3,000 bill for your stay in the hospital at that time. So we need free testing. We need more testing because we cannot ease social distance requirements without an increase in capacity for testing. We need the data broken down by race so that we understand how this virus is affecting all of our communities. And we need to move towards a Medicare for all system. We need to ensure that all people, no matter what is going on, are able to access the healthcare they need to live their lives.
Mm-hmm. Turning to economic solutions in the short term, to what extent do you believe that the stimulus packages that have passed so far meet the needs of all Americans?
They just haven't. They have not met the moment. We need to keep people on the payroll. We need more cash assistance for the duration of this crisis. Over 70% of voters say that the $1,200 relief plus $500 per kid will only cover a month or less of expenses. And all we're doing is we're postponing bills. So there is some relief right now from eviction if you are unable to pay your mortgage or your rent. But in 2 months, that rent or mortgage is still going to be due, and you are going to have to pay all of the back months, and there is no income coming in. And so the economic relief that has been passed so far just really is inadequate for most people facing this crisis.
What do you want to see in the next economic relief package that does meet the needs of all Americans?
Yeah, so we have a few priorities in the next bill. The first being an essential workers' bill of rights. There are still millions of people going to work every single day that are keeping us safe and allowing our economy to continue while we stay at home. And those folks don't have the protections that they need. They don't have the rights that they deserve, and they need to be adequately compensated for the work that they are doing in meeting this moment. We want increased regular cash payments for the duration of the crisis with no exclusions for any employment or immigration status. We need to fully fund our election, which means passing vote by mail and making sure that we have election protection. And it also includes saving the United States Postal Service, which is under threat right now with all of this going on. And we also support Representative Jayapal's Paycheck Guarantee Act, which is better than unemployment insurance because it would keep people on the payrolls they were already on before this crisis hit to ensure that folks are still getting a paycheck without having to wait in the lines that we've seen for unemployment.
We're speaking with Emma Einhorn, campaign director for MoveOn.org. Emma, your letter also speaks to the long-term impact of how we respond to this pandemic. This pandemic has opened our eyes to the impact of those inequalities, especially with the devastating disparities in death rates between Black and white Americans. What are some of the actions lawmakers can take now to build toward a more equitable future long after this pandemic is over?
Yeah, so we have seen for generations that communities of color are left out of government relief, and this just compounds as we look at the data. We need to build towards systemic change and not try to go back to normal. If we look at the statistics, essential workers are more likely to be people of color who are unable to stay home and not getting the protections they need at work. We recently have seen Trump attacking meatpacker plants. 44% of meatpackers are Latino. He's doing that because these are people who don't have the resources to fight back. Our healthcare system has failed people of color, which leaves them with more pre-existing conditions and therefore more susceptible to coronavirus. But this pandemic has also shown us what's possible and what our country supports. We can move towards healthcare for all and universal basic income and ending mass incarceration, things that Congress has already taken steps towards during this pandemic, because folks understand that we're in this situation due to no fault of our own. You know, a virus affects everyone equally and everyone needs to be included in the relief.
There will be silver linings in this whole thing. I mean, there just has to be, because it's all been so bad to this point, and this is a good way for us to learn. You know, it really is. I mean, whether it's the climate, whether it's the health care for all, or whatever it is, there's a lot of good that can come out of this if Congress shows will, and we can only hope that they do.
Yeah, and the American people are leading by example. We've seen thousands of mutual aid networks pop up because of the coronavirus, and people reaching out to their neighbors, trying to see how we can help. And so we just need Congress to follow everyone's lead.
Yeah. Now, as lawmakers continue to craft their response, they are responding to very immediate suffering. Few, if any, politicians want to appear like an obstructionist in order to hold out for what they want. But how do you convince Democrats that they may have to do exactly that if they want to advance a progressive agenda?
This is a complicated question, but my answer is just Congress's job is to legislate. There is no single bill that is going to be able to meet the scale of this crisis. So the House needs to be passing legislation left and right and forcing Republicans to come to the table, because otherwise the American people will hold them accountable for failing to serve their constituents and our country in this time of need. We also need all voices to be heard in the decision-making process. So we need the House and Senate to institute remote voting so that everyone can be voting on these bills. They need to pass more bills along the way and don't leave all of the negotiating just to Speaker Pelosi and Leader McConnell.
As crisis such as this, or a crisis such as this, asks us to examine our ideas around the role of government in our lives. The right wing is certainly seizing the day to an anti-government, pro-business agenda. What should be the message that progressives are putting out to challenge that?
It's the message they are putting out, that we need that we need an America that works for all, not just the wealthy and corporations. We've seen that the Republican solutions are not solutions for us. They are solutions for big corporations, for their wealthy donors, and we need Democrats to be fighting for all of us who are suffering in this pandemic.
Okay. Now, lastly, we may be in this new social distancing reality for a very long time. What are the unique challenges and even perhaps possibilities this poses for progressive organizers?
It has really been challenging these last couple of weeks, because not only are folks wanting to fight for the change that they need, they're also suffering from a pandemic. And so we can't contact our lawmakers in the same way. All of their phones are going to voicemail. They're not in their offices. They're not holding events. Protests have been happening online all over the country, but they're a little less visible to all of America since they're happening in these pockets on social media that aren't getting as much attention. And there's a lot happening in this crowded news cycle. Trump continues to attack our communities every single day, and that doesn't get the attention and the accountability it deserves. But there's also lots of possibilities. As I said, people are united. There are thousands of mutual aid networks popping up across the country, and there are digital tools that have been around for a couple decades, like at moveon.org, that folks are taking advantage of to organize their communities. We've had millions of people sign petitions in the last month and try to organize for change in their communities. So they are using these tools, they are taking a charge, and they are getting ready for this election in November that is a must win.
I don't know that there's ever been a more important November in our lifetime than there is that's coming up. And you got to get out and vote, or you've got to be able to mail it in, or whatever it is, but we definitely need the change. Emma Einhorn, campaign director for MoveOn.org, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Emma, thank you so much for your time. We'd love to have you back and talk about it again some more soon.
Thanks so much for having me, and hope you're all staying well.
Thank you. You as well. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, how the Electoral College makes people disappear. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
I love those nature shows that probe the behavior and intelligence of birds, elephants, and other fellow creatures. However, there's one exotic critter that shows have ignored and is crying out for analysis: humanoids superrichinoids. While some in this rare species seem like normal Homo sapiens, as a group, the superrichinoids exhibit aberrant destructive tendencies. In particular, an insatiable desire to accumulate boundless personal wealth, as if one's net worth is one's true worth. They view life as a primal competition to be number one, the richest of all. Robert Frank, an analyst of plutocracy, points to the insane competitive zealotry of Larry Ellison, the multi-billionaire co-founder of Oracle. Frank writes that when Ellison learned that a rival billionaire was having a 400-foot yacht built, a boat one-third bigger than a football field, Ellison rushed out to get a 450-foot yacht. Toys are one thing, but the uber-rich tend to feel entitled to exploit rank-and-file workers, crush small competitors, pay no taxes, rip off consumers, defraud investors, contaminate our environment, buy elections, monopolize markets, and demand to be publicly celebrated and idolized. But when poked, these wannabe demigods turn into wimps. Now that their freakish greed is being denounced by the American majority and politicians of both parties, the royals are squealing like pigs stuck in a fence. Their hubris is being openly mocked, and I suspect that their whimpering is due to their finally realizing that their bloated net worth can't buy respect, and they can't handle that reality. This is Jim Hightower saying we've got to get back to building a real economy based on the productivity and true genius of America's grassroots people.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Twice in 2 decades, the Electoral College has chosen a president who lost the popular vote. Journalist Jesse Wegman says it doesn't have to be that way, and the time is now to finally make every citizen's vote matter. And we say hello to Jesse Wegman, a member of the New York Times editorial board, where he has written about the Supreme Court and legal affairs since 2013. He previously worked as a reporter, editor, and producer at outlets including National Public Radio, The New York Observer, Reuters, The Daily Beast, and Newsweek. Jesse Wegman, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Our pleasure to have you with us. You know, obviously writing a book is a huge commitment. Why did you give a big piece of your life to this book?
Yeah, you know, it's funny when the idea came up, which was in, I think, 2017, soon after Donald Trump won the presidency while losing the popular vote. There was an element of it for me that was just the sort of emotional element, which is, I think, as tens of millions of other Americans, I just felt the rank inequity and unfairness of choosing the person who lost the election as our leader. And it's obviously the second time that happened in 20 years. I think when you get to issues of voting and electoral reform, they often appear dry to people, or people don't really connect to them. They don't feel it in their gut. And yet, you know, this is one issue where people were just consistently more emotional. They felt it. They felt viscerally affected by it. You know, how we choose our leader really is central to how we define ourselves as a nation. And so every time I spoke to somebody about the topic, I got that same response and that same energy that I was feeling. And I thought, you know what? If this many people are feeling it and I'm feeling it, then I think it's worth writing a book about it. And that gets to the other point, which is, so much of what we think we understand about the college is wrong, or there are misconceptions baked into it that go back for decades. And I really wanted to clear that up so that the debate we could have would be based on fact and history rather than on just sort of, knee-jerk prejudices. So I'm hoping that what this book can do, as it did for me in the course of writing and researching it, is to educate Americans so that, if they're going to disagree, at least they're going to disagree based on facts.
Yeah, and the title of the book, and I failed to mention, Let the People Pick the President, the case for abolishing the Electoral College. Many Americans don't really understand how the Electoral College works. What are some of the misconceptions that concern you?
I mean, one of the biggest ones, and this was something I even had to understand better as I was working on the book, is that when we talk about the Electoral College today, and when people say abolish the Electoral College or save the Electoral College, I think people aren't quite clear on what they're talking about saving or abolishing. The Electoral College, as it exists in the Constitution, is a pretty bare bones structure. All the Constitution does is it says each state gets a number of presidential electors equal to its representation in Congress. That means its number of House of Representatives members plus its 2 senators, right? So California has 53 members in the House. It has 2 senators, so it gets 55 electoral votes. That's pretty much all that's in the Constitution. There are a few other provisions about what to do if nobody wins a majority of electors. But, put that aside for now. The way that we experience the Electoral College functioning today really is the function of state governments, state lawmakers, choosing how to award their electors and how to choose those electors in the first place. That is purely left to the states by the literal language of the Constitution. It says in whatever manner the states shall direct, they may award their electors. 48 of 50 states award their electors by what's called the winner-take-all rule. And that's really at the heart of the distortion that is caused by the way the Electoral College works today. It is also a purely state-based decision. There's nothing constitutional about it. And that really is, that's a point I think most people misunderstand, is that the way the Electoral College works today, there's nothing set in stone about it. We can change it tomorrow. States can change it tomorrow, and that's really at the heart of the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which is what we can talk about more further on. But that's, I would say, along with the other misconceptions which have to do with the domination of big cities or the protection of small states, which are also just misconceptions, that's really the biggest one, is that the way the college works is entirely within our control.
Well, to many Americans, the Electoral College seems like a betrayal of the essential idea of democracy. How are we to understand the men who created this system? And yes, of course, it was men. Did they not care about democracy?
No, I think that's a fairly, a lot of people say that or think that, and it's a bit of another misconception, or at least an oversimplification of what was going on. Remember, the founders, the men who framed our Constitution, certainly they were men of a certain social class. They were men. They were of a certain gender. They were of a certain race. There's no question about that, and everything about the Constitution I think we have to look at through that lens. Nevertheless, they didn't distrust the people in the way that I think most of us imagine that, what that term means today. They let the people vote directly for their members of the House of Representatives. That they considered to be the most powerful branch of government, and they were fine with it being a direct election. What they were concerned about with the presidency, which was, remember, this was a new office that was being created in 1787 at the Constitutional Convention. It did not exist under the Articles of Confederation, was that a person who represented the entire country was going to be a national leader and probably not known to many of the eligible voters around the country because there was no communications network, there was no transportation network, people lived close to home. So really, I think what they were concerned about was a lack of knowledge on the part of most citizens, not that people were ignorant by nature or dangerous by nature. They were fine with having people involved. They just wanted it to be an informed decision. Obviously, today that's not an issue. So to the extent that that was one of the rationales for the Electoral College, it's out the window. Everybody knows everything they could possibly want to know, and in many cases often more, about the candidates who are running for president. But the founders themselves, I think, they were working in a fundamentally different society. They had different expectations. Obviously, they didn't think that anybody else should be voting besides themselves, people of their own class, no black people, no women, no Native Americans, no poor whites. And that's not the case today. So I think The reason that when you say that most of us today think it's a violation of our representative democracy and of the ideals behind that democracy, that's the reason, is that, we today assume that everybody has a role in the election of our leaders, and yet we were working with a system that was designed for a time when it didn't.
And of course, there have been, hundreds of attempts to abolish the Electoral College, but why have they all failed?
Well, you're right. There have been well over 700 attempts to either amend or abolish the Electoral College in the Constitution itself, and that's far more than for any other provision of the Constitution. I think that just drives home the point that people have been uneasy with or very unhappy with the way we choose our leader from the start. These efforts go all the way back to the late 18th century and continue into right now. The reason they've failed is largely, I think that there's a few reasons, but a big one is that the forces defending the status quo are always, going to be more likely to defend the status quo because it's how it got them elected, and also because people think, either rightly or wrongly, that the Electoral College helps them and helps their party. And you can go back and see this throughout history, that the defenses of the Electoral College that have been most fervent have not been about the principle of, I think people talk about, we're 50 states. We're not a nation. It's a weird thing to say about the United States. It's literally called the United States. I just think that people defending the college are defending it primarily because they think it helps them win. You can see that in the effort that got closer than any other effort in American history to abolishing the college in the late 1960s. It actually an amendment passed the House of Representatives overwhelmingly. 80% of Americans defended the Electoral College. 80% of Americans supported a popular vote for president at that time, including many Republicans like Richard Nixon, George H.W. Bush, Bob Dole, Gerald Ford. This was as broad an effort to get to a popular vote as we've ever seen in history. The reason it was blocked was because of a coalition between Southern segregationist senators and black political leaders in the North. Why? In both cases, because they thought, for different reasons, that the existing Electoral College helped them, gave them extra leverage in the election. They both happened to be right in that case, but it's funny to see how these sort of strange bedfellows are both working together to defend a system purely because they thought it helped them.
We're speaking with Jesse Wegman, member of the New York Times editorial board, and talking a little bit about his book, Let the People Pick the President, the case for abolishing the Electoral College. Jesse, many, many reasons to question the Electoral College, too many, of course, to go into in the time we have. But as you wrote in the New York Times, 80% of voters might as well be invisible when it comes to choosing their leader. Explain how this works.
Yes, and that's exactly, the heart of the problem on the practical side. There's the principle of it, right, which is, political equality. One person, one vote. Everybody's vote should count equally in a modern representative democracy. It doesn't under the Electoral College. And then majority rule, which is the person who wins the most votes wins the election, which is how we run every election in the country except for this one. I think those are principles that really drive the feeling that the Electoral College is not fair the way it operates today. But this other point that you're making is really the practical on-the-ground effect of how the college operates. And that is really corrosive to the functioning of our system, regardless of who wins the presidency. So what that that 80% number refers to the percentage of Americans living in states that we call safe states, right? Those are states in which the outcome is clear enough before the election that neither candidate bothers to spend any time or money or attention in those states. And the effect that has is the concerns of the people in those states are completely ignored, right? Candidates don't have to worry about what voters in California or New York want, or Texas and South Carolina, because they know the Republicans know they're going to win some of those, and the Democrats know they're going to win some of those. And that's a really harmful thing for a representative democracy, in choosing a leader who has to cover the whole country, not just a small handful of states. That small handful of states we call battleground states. Those are the states in which a few votes moved left or right will actually swing a huge bucket of electoral college votes. And what that ends up doing is it means that the candidates basically focus all of their time and attention on just those states. This is the effect of this winner-take-all rule, the way that the 48 out of 50 states award their electoral votes. And it's really the most corrosive part of the Electoral College as it functions today. So that's what I'm arguing for changing, really. It's less about whether we abolish or not the Electoral College. It's about choosing our leaders by all people having an equal voice in choosing the leader of the country. So that's where I come down.
You touched on something a few minutes ago as well, and there are concerns about the Electoral College having an impact on voters of color. Share your concerns with us, if you would.
Absolutely. Right now, you can see some bias in favor of states that are whiter and older, lean more conservative in the Electoral College. Obviously, that has always been the case. The fact that the Senate exists is itself a bias in favor of smaller and whiter states. And there is some Senate carryover. That effect carries over somewhat into the Electoral College because every state gets 2 electors for its senators, regardless of its size. So when people say, oh, Wyoming voters have more influence, 4 times as much power in the Electoral College as California voters, that's technically true because Wyoming has those 2 senators just like California, even though California's population is 80 times the size of Wyoming. But it's actually not that big an effect. The real effect comes from what I've been talking about, which is the winner-take-all rule. And that is the distorting factor. And that is why, say, black voters in the South are essentially unrepresented in the election for president, because while there are millions and millions of black voters in the South, and they lean overwhelmingly in favor of Democrats, those states are, have just enough of a majority of Republican voters, white Republican voters, that their winner-take-all rules mean that all of their electoral votes go to the Republicans. So millions of black Democratic voters in the South are erased in our election. That goes, by the way, that's the same for Republican voters in California. There are millions of Republicans in California who are also erased because California gives all of its electors to the winner of its statewide vote, who is now reliably the Democrat. This is happening across the country to people of all different colors and religions and genders all over the country. And that's really what the harmful effect is that people are not counted effectively in our choosing the president, and it means the president ends up not serving the people but serving tiny constituencies that get him or her elected.
Well, another common concern, and even some research to support it out there, that in the present day, the Electoral College benefits Republicans versus Democrats. Does your research support that idea?
There have been a few studies that have come out recently that have supported that notion. And what they show is that Republicans are significantly more likely to win a split election. And by split election, I mean an election where the Electoral College and the popular vote don't line up. I think that may be true. It certainly was true in 2016. But I think I would caution people not to get too hung up on that, because really over time, the Electoral College does not benefit one party or the other. In retrospect, you can look at an election and say, I see this year the Democrats had a slight advantage. So that was true for Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012. In 2016 and probably in 2020, the Republicans have the slight advantage. Over the long haul, it all evens out. And you really see actually a remarkable balance in how the Electoral College works. And the parties adapt also, constantly are adapting to, win more votes. So like you're seeing now, as Democrats are losing states in the upper Midwest that they used to consider reliably theirs because of unions and, certain voting patterns, they are now gaining states in the Sun Belt, Arizona, New Mexico, and places like that, that they didn't used to have because of, say, immigration and people, larger Latino communities and the changing demographics there. So states are always, parties are always adapting to political realities on the ground and essentially equalizing each other and trying to win as much as they can. The bottom line is, Republicans can win the popular vote just as well as Democrats. Republicans won 5 of 6 presidential elections in the popular vote before Democrats won 6 of 7. So I think when you pull the lens back from our immediate political reality, you start to see that balance playing out.
Mm-hmm. Now, to write this book, you spoke to campaign managers, field directors, ground game coordinators from both parties. Were there some common themes that emerged in terms of how they view the Electoral College?
Absolutely. It was a fascinating and fun part of the book to write. I interviewed dozens of people from both sides of the aisle, and I asked them first, how did you campaign to win the Electoral College, and then how would you have changed your strategy to win under a popular vote? And almost to a person, they all said they would have preferred to run a popular vote campaign, and that's because they saw up close the distorting effect of having to campaign in just a few states and in even just a few regions of those few states to win an election, where you have to then govern the entire country. So one of the things that they really emphasized was, this idea, this misconception that, if we get rid of the Electoral College, then suddenly New York and California are just going to decide our president for us every time. And it's just simply not true for a couple of reasons. One is, I think when people say that, they just profoundly misunderstand the math of it, that these large cities are nowhere near big enough relative to the population of the country as a whole to determine the outcome of the election. If they were, how did George W. Bush, who didn't win any of those large cities, win 3 million more votes nationwide in 2004 than John Kerry? You just can't explain it by way of the big cities. But the other reason is that when you talk to these campaign managers, you find out that it is campaigning 101 to run your campaign when a campaign has to win as many votes as possible, when all votes are counted as equal and you have to win the most to win the election. They go everywhere. So you look at governor's races, you look at battleground state races in the presidential election. In both of those cases, they're sort of a proxy for a national popular vote because those two conditions apply, right? That all votes count the same, and the person who gets the most of those votes wins. And when you have a campaign in a state like that or in a jurisdiction like that, you find that the candidates go everywhere. They don't go to the cities at the exclusion of the countryside. They don't go to the suburbs at the exclusion of both the cities and the countryside. They go everywhere based on where people live, and that's because they need the votes. Even if they know there's a region where they're not going to win outright, they would like to lose by less. So they go there, and they'll all tell you this. They'll say, of course we do. This is like, any governor, any candidate for governor goes all over the state. Why would they do that except because that was the best way to win? So I think this idea, this sort of knee-jerk response that, New York and California will dominate every election, is just not borne out by the facts on the ground of numbers, pure numbers, but also it's not borne out by the way that campaigns actually run.
Before we let you go, and you brought this up at the beginning of our conversation, let's talk about the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. How would it work, and is it reasonable to think it could actually be enforced?
So this gets back to a point I was making at the beginning, which is that a great misconception is that the way the Electoral College operates today is somehow baked into the Constitution. In fact, it's not. States have total authority to decide how to award their electors. That is the key, revelation behind this National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. Interstate compacts are deals that are made among states, that are contracts among states to do something or other, whether to create an interstate lottery commission or to negotiate water rights over a body of water that the states share. The National Popular Vote Interstate Compact is an agreement among states to award all of their electors differently, not by the winner of their statewide vote, as all but 2 states do today, but by the winner of the national popular vote. So the states that join this compact agree to give all of their electors to the candidate who wins the most votes in all 50 states in the country and the District of Columbia. So what that means, when you play out the logic of this, is that the person who wins. The one other component of this that's central is the compact does not take effect until states representing a majority of electors in the country, 270, which is how many you need to become president, join on. Once 270 electoral votes are represented in this compact, it automatically takes effect. and the candidate who wins the most votes in the country becomes the president. And that forces campaigns to campaign all over the country rather than, as they do now, only in the battleground states. I think that's a benefit to everybody, Republican or Democrat, who feels like they've been ignored or erased in our presidential election. The compact now has 15 member states that have joined, plus the District of Columbia, for a total of 196 electors. So remember I said you need 270 electoral votes for it to kick in. That means it's 74 votes away, less than a third left that they need to get. Those 74 votes are going to be harder to get than the first 196, and I do think it's possible. I think if we have more split elections, I think it's more likely. But I do think right now it's states with Democratic leadership that have passed it, and no state with Republican leadership has yet passed it. Although there is a lot of support for it among Republicans around the country, because I think a lot of regular Republican non-lawmakers and even some lawmakers do understand the basic unfairness of the system as it operates today. So I think one of the purposes of my writing this book was really to kind of strip away some of the misconceptions and myths that have propped up the Electoral College for so long, get people understanding it better, getting their facts straight, and then really engaging with their state lawmakers and their representatives to talk about how could we adopt this interstate compact here. If we're not going to have a constitutional amendment in the near future, I do think the compact is the cleanest and most elegant approach to a popular vote that's out there, and it's certainly the closest that we've come in more than a generation.
It just makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's I think it's time to get rid of such an archaic way of determining the leader of the greatest nation on earth, if you will. So.
Yeah, well, I completely agree, and I think most Americans would agree with you the moment that they sense that their own candidate is disadvantaged by this system. I have on the inside flap of my book, I have a quote, "The Electoral College is a disaster for democracy." That quote is from Donald Trump. He tweeted it out on election night 2012 because he thought, wrongly as it turned out, that Mitt Romney was going to win the popular vote and lose the Electoral College to Barack Obama. Clearly that's not what happened, but just the mere hint that it might infuriated him. And my answer is, of course, I feel the same way. Look, consider how I feel. It's happened to my candidate twice in the last 20 years, and just the hint that it might happen to your candidate got you so furious. I think this is something that touches people really at their heart, and I think everybody understands the unfairness of not all votes counting the same, and of the loser winning and the winner losing. These are just basic violations of modern democratic governance. They're basic violations of a Republican government, small R Republican government. The founders themselves said this, that majority rule is the essence of Republican government. This is not a complicated argument, and I really do think that to the extent we can pull back from the partisan elements of this, I think everybody agrees.
Absolutely. Let the people pick the president. The case for abolishing the Electoral College. Jesse Wegman, the author, also a member of the New York Times editorial board, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Jesse, thank you so much for your time with us today. Look forward to having you back again with us soon. Thank you so much. I'd be thrilled to come back. Fantastic. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with Stephanie Schriock, president of Emily's List, about why it's so important to have women in public office.
Well, Emily's List is the nation's largest organization funding women in politics. We are solely focused with a very simple mission to elect pro-choice Democratic women to office. That's it. That's what we do. We do that from the legislative level all the way up to the top, though we haven't quite gotten all the way to the top yet, but we're getting closer.
We got close, right? Yeah.
We are getting close. We were very close in 2016, and looking forward to a VP nominee this year as well. But we've been doing this work for 35 years. It's actually our 35th anniversary bill. We started in 1985, and you see the change from our very first big victory, which was Barbara Mikulski, for those who remember her, the longest serving woman in Congress, who retired just not that long ago from Maryland. And now to a historic number of women in Congress, particularly in the House, with the great success of 2018.
And it must be particularly important to you because the very first woman in Congress was from your home state of Montana, Jeanette Rankin.
That's right. Thank you for, my heart is always in Montana. And the story of Jeanette Rankin is really pretty extraordinary because she ran in a time where the 19th Amendment hadn't been passed yet. So Montana and a lot of Western states had allowed women to vote, but a lot of the eastern states had not done so yet. And so when she ran for the House in 1916, there was a lot of suffragettes, actually, who were really angry with her because they thought she would push the movement back. If she lost, and then if she won, how was that going to be perceived? It was very complicated in the movement, and she obviously won and served. She served one term, and she actually was the one, though it did not pass that particular Congress, she was the one who rolled out the 19th Amendment on the floor of the House. She's also known for good and bad, depending on how you line up, for being the one person who voted against going into World War I, lost her seat, came back then 2 decades later to win her seat again, just in time. She was a pacifist, just in time to vote against going into World War II, which was probably not the best choice on her part. But she was true to her values, and she really was a pacifist. And as I said, the first woman to serve, and before women across the country had the right to vote. It's really extraordinary.
Now, made history in several very, very important ways. So some people, of course, think Emily's List named after Emily Dickinson.
Aw.
No, not true,
not
right?
True. Not true, but that's not, I don't know if I've ever heard that. That's very sweet. No, Emily is actually an acronym. Our founders came together, our founder, Ellen Malcolm, who's really the stateswoman who brought this all together and is, frankly, the shoulders I stand upon to continue her legacy.
Great person and a great friend. Yeah,
truly
incredible.
Phenomenal. Just what she's done is really, really extraordinary. But they wanted something that was catchy, and she's a great marketer. And they came up with this idea, Emily, which stands for early money is like yeast.
Perfect.
It helps make the dough rise. It helps make the money rise in this case. And a lot of folks go to that now and use that. And the truth is it works. It is actually very true.
Why so important to have women in elective office?
I think it's the same reason that we just need diverse voices in office, the same reason we need more African Americans and Latinx and Asian American. We should have governments in our country, both at the local, state, and I should say not just both, but across the board, local, state, and federal level, that looks like our nation, because it is impossible to represent communities without at least some of those voices from those communities there. And when you're looking at a nation that is, by the way, majority female, I hate to say it, guys, there are more women than men in this country. It's just the way that the demographics work, that there's no reason why there's any governing body that doesn't have at least an equal number of women and men. And what that results in, and we've already seen it, is a change in the debate about every policy. It's not just one set of policies. It is how we look at our family policies, our community policies, but also how we look at climate change, how we look at our military, how we look at our economy, because all of these issues affect everybody. Mm-hmm. And just bringing a different set of opinions and ideas from women has really altered the conversation, and I would argue in a really well-balanced way.
And you are active not just at the federal level, House and the Senate, right? But also state legislatures, governors down the line, right? Encouraging women to run and supporting
entirely.
them.
And that is and that has actually grown a lot at Emily's List in the last, really the last 4 years, but really in the last decade. We have set up an initiative. Initially, it was called Focus 2020. It is now in partnership with our another initiative, Run to Win, because since the 2016 election, over 50,000 women have come to Emily's List wanting to run for office. Whoa. Like maybe not knowing for what office or how to do it, but to know that they wanted to make change in their communities. And so we built out these programs, and you should go to the website, emilyslist.org, look at our training center. There's great tools. If you're just pondering running and you don't know, like, what kind of office, what should you be thinking about? How do you put this together? How do you ask for money? How do you, when we get back to going door to door, which may be a while, but like, how do you talk to voters? All of that is on our training center now. And there's also a really great Facebook group of women. I think it's close now to 8,000 women who are in community talking about what it is to run for office, whether it's city council or school board or higher up. And it's really been, it's a really awesome community building activity. And what we're seeing is more women are running for office across the board.
Is there perhaps any one major factor in the last 4 years that has prompted a lot of women to want to run for office?
Like for 30 years, Emily's List went out and begged women to run for office, mostly. We still do a little of that, I will be honest. There are certain districts we got to go on the ground and recruit. But no doubt the election of Donald Trump definitely spurred a huge amount of energy among women and the desire that they had to do something. And they've done something in different ways. I mean, we have this huge group, tens of thousands who want to run for office, but there's also tens of thousands who have turned into activists, who have started their own organizations, who have joined other organizations like Indivisible. I mean, you think about some great progressive organizations that have started since 2016. A lot of them are either run by women or their local chapters are really driven by the energy.
Run for Something is one that I
Run for Something is a great one we work with, who focus more on millennials, and they're fantastic. The Women's March that came out of the immediate movement, they still have local groups. I mean, it's just kept growing and growing, and it's really made a huge difference. And what it's resulting in our opinion, is really like more diverse voices of women stepping up to run. And you can particularly see that in 2018, when Emily's List led the way in taking back the Democratic majority in the House. And we're proud to say that we did it with enough women to take the majority alone. There were some good men that won, and I'm really grateful for them too, because Speaker Pelosi deserves as big of a margin as she can get, and we're hoping to add to that margin in 2020. But if you look at that class, they are from all over the place, geographically, age, right? You have the youngest and you have the oldest. You have women who come from nursing backgrounds and teaching backgrounds. You have doctors. You've got moms. You've got folks who are just all over the place.
Military.
It's awesome. Lots of military. That's been a great change. You got some scientists. We could use a few more doctors. Thankfully, we got some doctors and scientists running right now. We could sure use more of those. We've got Dr. Barbara Boyer running for U.S. Senate in Kansas. And every time I talk to her, I'm like, we need you bad. Like, you actually know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I want to get to some of those important Senate races. But also, as you mentioned, in the diversity in 2018, the first Native American women ever elected to Congress, and the first 2 Muslim women ever elected to Congress.
Yeah, which is like amazing and exciting, and also like, geez, what took us so long? There is a little bit of that. Just as a reminder, like, we still have so much work to do. Like, we're talking about a moment that we still in 2018 hadn't elected a Native American woman to Congress is sort of mind blowing. And I'm so grateful that Sharice Davids and Deb Haaland, with our help and support, made it to Congress, and also have taken it upon themselves in a really, like, on top of their job, on top of being a candidate, on top of running for re-election, to go into their communities and encourage other women in the Native American community to run for office. Like, it's a really amazing sisterhood that's happening across the country within these communities.
And you mentioned that you used to have to do maybe more recruiting than you do today, right? But whether you're finding these candidates or they're coming to you, what do you tell them is the most important? How do they get started? Is it ability to raise money? Is it organizing?
No, the first conversations we have is really basic. Like, why do you want to do this? Like, what is it that is driving you to run? And tell us your story. Let's we spend a lot of time early on with potential candidates or candidates about their story. Because I can't speak about that many men. I've worked for a number of men, but I will say getting women to talk about themselves and their story, and then how their story relates to the voters and the community, that's the key. And their stories are amazing, but they're hesitant because they don't tend to want to talk about themselves. They want to talk about how to fix the problems in the community, which is why they make such great, like, public servants. Like, they're so good. But I was like, before you get there, though, you have to be able to connect. So we spend a lot of time on personal story and figuring out how that's going to work in the community. Then we get into the details of the campaigns. We'll figure out, how do you raise the money? How do you find the staff? How do you, depending on the size of the campaigns? Because keep in mind, if you're running for the legislature in some states, you might not even have a staff person. You might have an all volunteer operation. You're running for the U.S. Senate, you could end up by the end of the election having, 50 staff people, 60 staff people. So it really is different at different levels of those campaigns. And we can help with all of that. So to me, it's not about the tactics of the campaigning itself. It's do you have it in you, in your gut, to do the work? Because it's really hard to do. But if you're hungry enough and you're willing to learn, because there's no one knows exactly how to do this until you start doing it. And we've got great trainings, but I tell women, the best training is the on-the-job training. Like, just run and you will start learning it very, very quickly. Because that's like, you could do 20 trainings. It's still not going to help you until you start running. And you're like, oh, that's how I have to deal with that question when I go into the grocery store just trying to buy some milk in the evening. And someone comes running up to you asking about, the policy in Iran. So like, until you get into it, you're just, you're going to learn as you go. And that's, so are you willing to do that?
Bill Press talking with Stephanie Schriock, president of Emily's List. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressPods.com. That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Emma Einhorn, Jesse Wegman, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.